Hey guys, my name is Micha. I'm from Germany, excited to do this seminar with you together with my friend
Jonatas. My name is Jonatas and I'm from Lisbon, Portugal. I am a father of four, a translator, musician, and passionate for Jesus and following him in my neighborhood.
Great. So we want to talk with you about moving in as missions. That's something that's very close to our heart. You'll hear a bit from us what that means to us. And we thought the best way to do this is actually just to have a conversation with each other about a few questions that we're going to ask each other. And so I'm just going to start right away and ask you, Jonatas, what does that mean to you, moving in as missions?
Yeah, so missions, it's a word that's kind of fallen out of my daily, lexical, because once we moved into our neighborhood, we lived in downtown Lisbon, together with a team of people. We moved in mainly to pray and to be present. So this is how I would describe. So it is a high needs neighborhood with no or little to no evangelical Christian presence. And it's a neighborhood with the highest concentration of different nationalities in the entire country. So around 90 different nationalities, and with a lot of Muslims and people from different countries like Southeast Asia and South Asia, and secular Europeans. So this is the place where God called us, and it basically just means living a daily life of presence, becoming a character where people get to know you and to know your life in your neighborhood, but also doing it, participating in what God is doing in this place. So this means praying here every week with other Christians who are part of our team. This means trying to be as local as possible in everything we do intentionally. So praying, playing, and working as much as possible in this neighborhood to create a rooted presence here, following Jesus every step of the way. So I'm curious, Misha, I know you don't live in Lisbon, so where do you live? And share a bit about us. How does this look for you moving in as mission?
Yeah, so I live in the heart of Berlin, in a part of the city called Neukölln, in a high-rise building there, lots of apartment buildings with about 6,000 people, more than 80% also from a migrant, mostly Muslim background. But back to the question, what does it mean to move in as missions? To me, something that absolutely fascinates me about God is that his idea of making himself known to us as people was to send an actual person, something that we can relate to, someone that we can relate to 2,000 years later, because we can imagine what that person was like, what Jesus was like, how he lived, how he interacted. And my personal experience in my faith journey has also been learning a lot about who Jesus, who God is, from other people, from just seeing how they live life, how they interact with each other, how they think about different topics, and how they spend their life, how they spend their time. And to me, moving in as missions is essentially that it's joining Jesus, who is already here. His presence is everywhere, but it's basically joining him in a very concrete way in one particular neighborhood, where there's usually, at least in my case, there's very little Jesus following presence there. And it's just a way of spending time with people and trying as good as I can to be an example, more so maybe someone who's trying to point to who Jesus is by the way I live, by the way I interact with my neighbors, by the way I live normal, regular life in my neighborhood. So that's what moving in as mission is to me. But Jonatas, you mentioned you live in the heart of Lisbon. You've been there for quite a while. Talk a little bit about what you're doing there. But I think that would be interesting just to hear more about that. What does it look like to to be living in a neighborhood intentionally, and how are you trying to basically live out what Jesus' teachings about loving your neighbors are? How are you guys doing that?
I think one aspect that I would like to stress, and of course, we don't want to make this conversation, highly theological, because I think there's enough
Absolutely.
of that in this gathering. But one of the things where I found out in this past 5 years of being here, when I moved in here with my wife Ines, we had one child. Now we have 4, so things look a lot different. I
Congrats,
was
man.
working at a company. You're welcome. I was working full-time at a company, and I ended up leaving my job and taking a career as a freelancer so I could be more available here in the neighborhood. And one of the things that we found out is that, and one of the hardest things in following Jesus's example is, when Paul tells us that Jesus is limited himself when he became man out of flesh and bone. He limited himself. So our world, our culture, especially here in Europe, is constantly pushing us to live outside the limits and boundaries that God defined for us. And when you move in and you decide that you will invest in a specific place, a rooted place with specific people, which are the people that God already placed there, in a sense, your neighbors, the people who have businesses close to where you are, and the people who end up spending their time there. And you decide to orientate your life to just kind of like you have a compass, and the compass is always pointing to limiting your options. So you decide not to leave to somewhere, not to look for what's most comfortable, not to look for a better home, not to look for a lot of the things that are just part of regular life in our modern Europe. uh, I think this teaches us a bit about, and the frustration that it sometimes it breeds in your heart. And this is true. We don't hide it. It is because we are not naturally wired to follow the path that Jesus followed, which is to limit himself for love. Because he loved mankind so much that he chose to limit himself and follow a life that he suffered and died, and then of course God rose him again. But there's this whole path, and when you choose to move in to a neighborhood and live intentionally like this, you have to give up a lot of things, and that is a lot of what it looks like. But then God really opens your eyes and makes you see that a lot of the things that are hidden, they start to be visible, sort of like revelation, once you have the time to pay attention. So I think these would be the aspects. I'm not saying it is easy, because it's very countercultural in a sense. You have to always fight, the urge and the flow to move out, to be timeless, to be better, and to be more comfortable all the time. But this also is what it means to follow Jesus in a very concrete aspect in this neighborhood.
And like what would some specific, or maybe one specific example, maybe one relationship that you formed that you think you would have never had you not moved into your neighborhood?
We have some very, very good relationships with some of our neighbors, and I can tell you that it's the fact that we started to invest relationally in knowing our neighbors' names, and asking them simple things like how are you doing, that evolved over the years into sharing moments of happiness, moments of grief, and then also when new neighbors come, we had a huge conflict in our building, because of our children. They're very loud, and it's an old building, so there's no isolation, the sound travels everywhere. And we had new neighbors downstairs who were not used to this radical lifestyle at all. And so but then there was already a culture where I think is a spirit-filled culture of looking out for each other in nurturing empathy and even love, you know, for neighbors between Christians and non-Christians, because we have 3 Christian families living in our building.
Okay.
But the way we've been reaching out allowed us to solve that conflict and become friends with our neighbors who initially were really, really angry with all the noise.
Okay.
And this is just an example of people that probably different generations. How about praying with the husband of a Jehovah's Witness in the stairwell, in the staircase of your building? That is something that I never thought would happen, and it did. So, but I'm curious to hear about you. I know you have a very different experience, especially because you have a lot of young people in your neighborhood, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I don't have kids yet, not 4, not even 1. There's one critical part missing to having it. So I'm actually sharing my apartment with right now it's 2 other young Christians that also moved here to say we want to be present in this neighborhood together. And that's, to me, is a very critical part to move in with an intention, is that you actually try to live out in a sense of community or form of community what Jesus is teaching, and then to invite other people into that presence. And I would summarize the last 3 years of having lived here basically is that we try to live out Jesus' teachings in our community as believers together. And we just have an open door policy, which means when we meet people, we have quite a lot of floors in our building, so you always meet someone in the elevator, and everyone knows the awkward elevator silence. So we forced ourselves. We just made a rule to say if you're in the elevator with someone, you have to start a conversation. It doesn't matter what it is. Talk about the puddle of whatever on the floor that you're trying to avoid, but start a conversation and just be hospitable and invite people. And that's actually how we met. For example, our next door neighbors, an Iranian family that fled from Iran through different countries, ended up in Germany. Wonderful people. They have 3 boys, and we spent a lot of time with them. And so we, over the last 2 years, we've taken them on vacation. We talked about the Bible with them because they were really curious. There was different situations where we were able to pray for them, mostly on their educational journey. And that to me is an example of just being present. And those relationships would have never happened had we not lived here. There's just no overlap of my regular life and the life of the people that I now live amongst. And really the only way to kind of intertwine those lives is by living here. And another thing that became very concrete for me as a result of moving in here, I started asking people in my neighborhood what they would wish were different. We kind of phrased the question in that way. A lot of people talked about the rats in the neighborhood. We didn't really know what to do about those. But poor education was another topic that most families talked about. Our kids, we came to Germany, we came to Berlin because we want a better future for them, and they're still struggling. We don't know what to do. And so that led me to start a tutoring business. That's my full-time job now. I spend a lot of time with kids in my neighborhood, and I have a different staff that go to the families' homes or do tutoring in the local schools here. And that's, to me, also a very Jesus-inspired way of actually being a blessing in the community. It's something that I would have certainly never started had I not moved in here.
Yeah, I think
so.
It's just to add, just to wrap this up. I think one of the things that underlies, you know, the why we feel it really a spirit-led thing, like to move in and live intentionally in a neighborhood, is that Jesus, when he kind of moved into the neighborhood, so to speak, he also lived in a particular place in a particular time. And when he interacted with people, as we read throughout the Gospels, he also addressed people in the place where they were and their particular needs and reached out to them. If you think about the Samaritan woman at the well, You see how Jesus was there at that time and really addressed not only her material needs, but the spiritual needs as well. And when we move in and are open to the possibility of being a vessel and carrying a cup of water, but also the spirit within us to the people who just live next to us. We don't need to go looking for who to serve because they're right next to us, and we don't need to go looking for who to love because those people are just next to us. And this is something that we are really committed to, and we really want to encourage more Christians everywhere to do this and to live like this.
That's actually a great segue, Jonatas, to kind of my final question to you, because maybe by now some of the listeners are curious what that could mean for them to be more intentional in their neighborhood. And so I just want to ask you, what recommendations would you have for someone who maybe wants to be more intentional where they already are? Or, and I think that's something that we also think is really important, that maybe are called to a different neighborhood, one that they naturally would have never moved to. What would you say to those kind of two questions?
So very quickly, I would say that this is something that is not out of reach to anyone. So it doesn't matter where you come from or where you are. If you have, a committed relationship to following Jesus, and you are, I would say, you are qualified to go and live, because you don't need a degree to live a prayerful life, a life of prayer, a life of love, a life of service. And that is mainly what moved us in the beginning. That we didn't have the special training, we didn't have special equipment, we didn't have enough money to move in. But that's a whole other story. We can leave it to Q&A. But we prayed a lot, and we had confirmation that the Lord was really, moving us towards that step. So I would say that you should pray first and seek the Lord's direction. But just so you know, there is no special qualification other than wanting to love the Lord with all your heart, mind, and soul, and deciding to do it and starting that path to actually start doing it. And you might not be called to move to a different continent, but maybe you are called to cross your street and start to develop a relationship with your neighbor who you might not know, for example. So I think these would be my very quick thoughts, because we could go on forever about this.
Right.
So Micha, I know you haven't told this yet, but you were once in a leadership position in a Christian ministry called Move In, where your responsibility was to also encourage and to mobilize people to move in to unreached and high needs neighborhoods in Europe. So I'm really curious, and I think we all are, to hear what would you say. What is your answer to this question? How would you encourage others to move in as missions?
Yeah, one aspect that is just very kind of pragmatic that I love about this idea, and I'm coming from at least my role before I was with Movin was more in a traditional missions context, where usually people prepare for a long time and then they raise support and they leave their careers behind to go somewhere else. And I think that still has a place today. And I also think that God is calling a lot more people to stay in their jobs and to stay in their city, and maybe just to move, like you said, one street over, to be with people that are untouched by anyone, that have never really met anyone that really knows or is trying to know who Jesus is, and to reflect that outside. And that to me is basically I think the biggest reason. It's in a sense very simple. It's not complicated. You don't have to apply anywhere. Again, you don't have to ask your whole network to support you in this. You can continue your regular life and say, but I feel called and I want to join Jesus in what he's already doing somewhere where his presence is not yet felt very much. We believe it's there. Maybe it's just not. It hasn't like risen up yet. And another thing I would say is that I am still very surprised to just learn that Jesus is in many places where I didn't expect him to be. It's been very humbling, but also it's made me really excited about how God is speaking to people, because I think I put him in a little bit of a box and said he can, he can be experienced in this or that context. And what I'm learning more and more and more is that God can't be put in a box. And he's not just working in specific contexts, but he's actually everywhere, and he's inviting people to join him there. And I think it's a worthy consideration to think about places where maybe his presence isn't yet established very much, where there aren't a lot of believers, where it's not normal to talk about Jesus or to be excited about who he is. And that's my experience most of the time. Most of my neighbors, they don't know anything. I was a teacher recently. It was just part of the tutoring business. I had a grade 5 class, and in the history lesson, we somehow ended up talking about Jesus. They had no idea. 19 out of 19 children in my class didn't know who that name referred to, the 12-year-olds. And so they've just never heard of it. And I think there just needs to be more people that are excited to get into a context where that's the norm. And then they get to maybe be the first person just in a normal relationship to first show, and also when the time is right to talk about who this Jesus is, and to invite other people to join him as well.
Yeah, and I don't know if we have time, because Micha is always in charge of tracking the clock and telling me when it's time to shut up. But
got 1 minute.
1 minute. I would say that it is essential that when you consider doing this, moving in, that you consider the community aspect. So we're not saying that this is something that any Jesus follower should do by himself, because community is essential to this. That's why with move in, we move in teams, whether 2, 3, or more people. And when you do something like this, we're not saying you should go alone. Of course, eventually God might call people to move alone to to different places, but usually a good rule of thumb is to consider how God himself is a community of 3 persons. So there is the community aspect is essential then to the formation that you will experience when you move in, because God will be working in you throughout the whole time. And that will also be part of the transformation that you hopefully want to see in the neighborhood when you start participating with the Lord in what he's doing. So if you have friends who might consider, or people from your church, or even from different churches, it doesn't mean that you cannot be a team that moves into a specific place. And whether if you're a student, for example, your university, whether you're retiring, for example, retirement is an excellent season of life to consider moving in and getting involved with a God project like this. And there is absolutely, I can't think, even we know of stories that we might be able to share with you later about even people with disabilities who find in living missionally or intentionally like this with a team in a high needs neighborhood, who find a way that God can use them and their unique gifts and abilities, even in disability, to be a blessing in the context, in the relational context of the neighborhood.
Great. Well, thanks, Jonatas. As always, it was nice to chat with you. Now, if you have any questions to either of us or both of us, we want to give you a chance to ask them. So we will see you in just a second in the Q&A.